Alright, so here's some help with the car showroom example in 6.4. Um, First of all, this car model, you don't do anything in here except notice that there's, uh, a constructor, a couple getters, and a toString method. You're going to need to use those getters, I think. So then we can shrink that down. So really what you're supposed to do is write the find car space method that returns the index of a car space. So that is right here. Okay, so this is where your code's going to go. So it's going to tell wherever the specified model is. If there's no car, that model is going to return a -1. So make sure you're returning an int even if it doesn't find anything. This is the easier of the two things here. Basically, you got to access its position in the list. Okay, and the list would be spaces. You can see it here. There's a private list of car models called spaces, so we're going to be using that a lot. So yeah, when you check this one, it makes a 7-car showroom, and then it fills 4 of them in at space 0, 1, 3, and 6. So you kind of get an idea what's going on. So basically, the first thing, find car space. Let's think about what we got to do for that. I'd like to use some comments here. We need to find the index based on the model name. So we're definitely going to need a for loop, right? So kind of a standard for loop that runs through the whole thing. We've written a few of these in our day now. Hopefully you're getting pretty good at them. I is 0, and then in this case I is less than, and our thing is spaces dot length. Man, I still can't spell that. Alright, and then I++, right? So nothing too crazy. Inside that for loop, you need to make sure that the first thing you do is notice if it's empty or not. So you can tell right here in their output that they're null otherwise. So the first thing I would do, don't try to get the name. If you just wrote like your getter, like spaces I get name, and it was null, it would throw a null pointer exception. So you need to put a little protection in on this one and start off with something like if spaces bracket I is not equal to null. So you basically need to think about only if the space is occupied will I do something. Okay, and then if the space is not null, then you got to think about how do you access the name and compare it to this name. Okay, so you got to think about, okay, spaces.I or spaces bracket I is a car model object. So if you went back here and you looked at it, you're like, okay, so car model has a name and a speed. And thankfully we got this getter for name, so you can compare it. Just be careful when you go to fill in, oops, where'd that go? There it is. When you go into fill what you're going to do, I'm going to eventually return I, but I need to think about how I'm going to tell is the name of that object equal to the name in here. So you want to make sure you're careful because it's a string, so you don't want to use equals equals and that sort of thing. But right here, you're going to need to check if the car name matches the name in find car space. Okay, so you want to see if the car name in the space matches the car name in the parameter that they entered up here. So if I put GTO and it's not in there, I want to make sure I'm careful that it returns -1 if it doesn't find anything. So you figure out what goes in here. That's a good setup. The harder one is the second one, and that is the consolidate. And this, I had to do some diagramming on this one, so I'll take a second to show you what I was thinking. And this is how I solved it. I looked at, their output here, and I looked, okay, what if I had 7 spaces and I only had a car in 0, 1, 3, and 6, but I know in the end I had to make sure I started at 0 and had no empty spaces between 2 cars. So the first thing I did was I kind of drew it out. This is my favorite way to attack these problems. So what started out was I had cars here, here, and here, and here. Okay, but now I need a new one where if it's the first car you come across, it stores in the first spot. If it's the second car, so it starts off pretty easy. You're just like, okay, I can just fill them in. But then when you get here, you need to make sure that you don't put an empty spot in. You actually take this guy and put him in here. And then nothing with this, nothing with this. I don't do anything with these guys. And then I should put this guy in here. So what I realized when I drew this out, this one goes through all the items and checks it each time. If it's not null, kind of like last time, if it's not null, I'm going to store it in my new array. But if it is null, I'm just going to move on past it, which made me think, okay, so my for loop is going to go through here and hit each item, right? It's going to go to index 0, 1, 2, just like normal. My eyes are going to count up. But this one, I don't want to move to a new space until I am ready, until it's filled the previous spot. I don't want to keep moving unless it's filled the spot. So I want a different letter that represents my spaces in this other one. So that's kind of how my brain did it. I noticed they were moving at different rates. So I thought, okay, my for loop's here, but I'm going to control what space I'm on in my new one as I go. So I'm like, okay, we're in consolidate here. Okay, so in consolidate, I need to first, and this you'll find often, a temporary array. And you can see I'm returning nothing because it says void consolidate. So I'm just going to overwrite, eventually I'm going to overwrite this spaces array. So I need to create a temporary array to store my cars in the correct order. Okay, so think of how you'd use the constructor. Okay, you can look up here for, some inspiration, but you're basically gonna, you're gonna have, I would call it temporary, right? So we're gonna say, what is it? A car model, bracket, bracket, temp equals new car model, bracket, and you don't want to force a 7 in there, just go spaces dot length, because you want to be able to work with any size. So that's the first thing you really need to do to get yourself unstuck. And then it's time for a loop. Alright, I'm going to let you write your for loop, right? But what I would first do before you get into your for loop is I need to make a new index for my temporary index. So I'm going to make a new integer. And I'm going to set it to 0 to begin with, but I'm only going to cycle that up if I find a winner, right? Because we went back to that picture. Okay, so this is based off of I equals 0, I equals 1, I equals 2. It's going through my for loop. My temporary, right, I can write temp. My temporary starts at 0, and the only time I'm going to bump it up is after it's 1, after I've stored something in it. So you want to, go through here. You can write a for loop, kind of a standard one, right? And then inside that for loop, you also want to kind of do the thing where if spaces bracket I is not null, because you want to protect against hitting a null pointer exception. Always something to watch out for. Right? Ignore empty spaces or else you're going to get yourself in trouble. Okay, so what the heck do I want to happen? Basically, I want two things to happen. One, I want to set my temporary spot to the current item. And two, I want to, since we found a winner, then you need to make sure your temp index goes up. It won't go up unless you found a winner. See how it's not null? Okay, so I want to make sure it's null, then it can go up, and then there's a super important thing at the end of this, because I'm sure you can figure out, you know, what goes in here to go through, iterate through the garage. Okay, and this is my, oops. My temporary index to control the temporary array. Now here's a super important thing. At the very end, do not forget this move. Because it's a void and I'm not returning anything, I don't want to do all this work and have it go nowhere. I'm basically creating this new array called temp. It's going to be stored like I want it to be, right? It's going to store them in all the spots and have nulls at the back. And basically, because it creates all nulls at first, I don't know if you remember that, when you make a new array, it fills them with all nulls if it's an object. So here's the important part that you could do all wonderful work, and at the end you might forget this step. So at the very end, reset spaces to the temp values. Okay, so you're going to reset all of the spaces array. You're going to be like spaces equals, and then you want to make sure it equals all the temp arrays. And are you allowed to do that? Heck yeah. When we do array lists, you're going to see there's easier ways to mess with this, but this is what we have to do with arrays, so we're kind of stuck. All right, so try that out. Hopefully this helped you get unstuck if you were stuck. And all right, I will talk to you later.